What kind of woman steps out of the dark, draws her sword, and changes the fate of a dying duke in a single moment, on a storm-soaked road far from the safety of his title? Duke Alistair Whitmore is ambushed, beaten, and left in the mud with death only seconds away. But just when it seems his story is about to end, a mysterious woman appears from the rain, silent, precise, and far more dangerous than the men who tried to kill him. What follows is not just a rescue, but the beginning of a secret, a love neither of them expected, and a truth powerful enough to shatter everything they built together. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now let's begin the story. Rain didn't fall that night so much as it pressed down heavy, relentless, as if the sky had decided the road itself deserved punishment. The forest track was barely a road at all, only a ribbon of churned mud between black trunks and wet undergrowth. Lantern light from the carriage rocked in the wind, splashing gold across puddles and vanishing again into the dark. The coach bore a noble crest, but it had been partially covered cloth drawn over bright heraldry straps, tightened as if secrecy could be lashed into place. Whoever traveled inside did not want the world to know. Within the carriage, Duke Alistair Whitmore sat with his cloak pulled tight, gloved hands, still posture measured. The kind of stillness that wasn't calm but calculated, like a man who had learned that movement could invite attention, and attention could invite danger. He stared past the glass at nothing in particular. The rain blurred everything into shifting shadows, but his gaze remained sharp. "Keep the pace," he told the driver, voice low. "No stops." The driver's answer was swallowed by the weather. The wheels cut through mud with a heavy, wet grind. Alistair didn't relax. He felt the night before he saw it, the change in the horse's rhythm, the way their breath sharpened. Then the lead horse screamed and reared, hooves slashing at air. The carriage lurched, tilted, and slammed down hard as the front wheel struck something unseen. The lantern swung violently. Light splintered across the interior. Alistair's hand went instinctively toward the hidden weapon at his side. Outside, the horses stamped and snorted in panic. Then shapes. Figures stepped from the tree line as if they'd been carved out of the rain. They moved with purpose, not with drunken greed. They didn't shout. They didn't laugh. They didn't call for coin. They simply closed in. The driver yanked at the reins, trying to calm the horses. A hand shot up from the dark and seized him by the collar. Another wrenched him down from the seat. He hit the mud with a wet impact that sounded like flesh on soaked earth. Alistair pushed the carriage door open and stepped out. The rain struck his face like needles. He stood tall anyway, cloak draped like shadow boots, sinking slightly into the mud. His voice cut through the storm, steady and controlled. "If it's money you want," he said, "you've chosen the wrong night." No one answered. Instead, he heard the unmistakable sound of metal leaving leather blades sliding free. One man stepped forward, closer than the rest. The hood hid most of his face, but his voice was blunt, almost bored. "Orders are orders." Alistair didn't flinch. The words landed with a clarity that chilled deeper than the rain. Orders. Not desperation, not impulse. This wasn't a robbery. His hand moved and steel flashed. He drew his sword in one smooth motion stance, snapping into place like something long practiced. The men around him shifted, surprised, perhaps, that their target hadn't begged, hadn't frozen, hadn't tried to bargain. Alistair lunged first. The nearest attacker raised his weapon too late. Alistair's blade came up angled, and the man went down with a strangled gasp. A second figure rushed in from the side, and Alistair pivoted, letting momentum pass, and then struck with a precise economy that spoke of training more than fury. The second attacker crumpled into the mud. For a heartbeat, the forest went still, except for rain and the frightened horses. Alistair's breath steamed faintly despite the wet cold. His grip was steady. Then the others moved. There were too many, at least 6, maybe 7, and they didn't rush like a mob. They spread out, forming angles, forcing him to turn to give ground to waste motion. One stepped in to draw his attention, another circled, another waited. Alistair felt the trap tightening. He managed to keep them from fully surrounding him, shifting his feet in the mud, fighting not only men, but the road itself. He cut toward one, forced him back, then spun to block another. His blade snapped up just in time to stop a strike aimed at his ribs. Metal met metal, ringing like a bell drowned in rain. But coordination beats skill when numbers are patient. A blow came from behind a club, or the butt of a weapon crashing into the back of his shoulder. Pain exploded down his arm. His sword slipped. For a fraction of a second, his grip failed. His blade fell into the mud with a soft, unforgiving sound. A man slammed into him. Another seized him from behind, locking his arms. Alistair twisted, tried to break free, drove an elbow back into a body. He heard a grunt, felt a shift, but the hold tightened again. A fist drove hard into his stomach, compressing breath from his lungs. The world narrowed to pain and rain, and the taste of iron rising in his throat. He dropped to one knee, mud soaking through his trousers, water running down his face like tears that weren't his. A voice, cold and satisfied, came from close by. "He's done. Finish it." Alistair lifted his head slowly. The man in front of him raised a weapon blade, or club, high enough that even the lantern light caught its edge. Alistair didn't beg. He didn't plead. Even half broken, he held the attacker's gaze as if daring him to take the final step. The weapon began to fall. And then from the darkness beyond the lantern's reach, a woman's voice cut clean through the storm. "Step away." Everything paused. The attacker froze mid-motion as if the words themselves had struck him. The men turned, confused, irritated. In that single suspended moment, rain seemed to hold its breath. A figure stepped out of the black. A woman in a soaked cloak hood, pushed back enough to reveal dark hair tied low at her nape. Her posture was straight, balanced, as if she owned the ground beneath her feet despite the mud. One hand rested on the hilt of a sword. For a heartbeat, the men stared at her like she was an inconvenience. Then one of them gave a short laugh, disbelief sharp in it. "Walk away, girl," he said. "This isn't your business." She didn't answer. She simply drew her blade. Steel slid free with a sound so clean it seemed to cut the night itself. Lantern light flickered across the edge, bright and merciless. She didn't warn them again. The nearest attacker lunged, eager to prove she was nothing. She moved once, small, precise, and he dropped as if someone had cut the strings holding him upright. There was no wasted motion, no flourish. Just a step, a turn of her wrist, and the man's threat ended. The others reacted too late. They came at her in pairs, then one by one, and each time she met them with the same chilling efficiency. Her feet were light, even in mud. She controlled distance the way a musician controls tempo. When someone struck high, she was already low. When someone tried to circle, she pivoted and cut their line. One man swung from behind, thinking he'd found her blind spot. She turned as if she'd been waiting for him, blocked with the flat of her blade, and drove him down with a single strike to the body's weak point. No anger in her face, no panic. Only focus. Only the sharp calm of someone who had fought before and survived by refusing to be careless. In less than a minute, most of the men lay scattered in the rain, groaning, or silent, sinking into the mud like dark shapes returned to the earth. One remained upright only because he had chosen flight over fight. He stumbled backward, then turned and ran. The woman Alara Vane, though no one here knew her name, followed without haste. She cut off his escape path with a single step blade, angled low. The man skidded, nearly falling. He lifted trembling hands, eyes wide under his hood. "Wait," he gasped. "We were paid. We didn't even know who." A sound ripped through the rain, thin, fast. An arrow. It struck him in the chest with a blunt, final force. His eyes widened in shock, mouth opening on a word that never came. Then he collapsed into the mud like a puppet cut loose. Alara didn't move for a long moment. She stared into the trees, into the deeper black, beyond the lantern's weak circle. She saw nothing, no flicker of movement, no retreating shadow. Only rain dripping from branches, only silence pretending it belonged. Someone had been watching. Someone had wanted that man silent. Alara lowered her sword slowly. Her expression remained unreadable, but her mind was already turning. This wasn't a common roadside attack. It was a purge, a deliberate, organized attempt to erase a person from the world. She turned back. The man in the mud, Alistair, still breathed. Barely. Alara knelt beside him, fingers finding his pulse with quick certainty. It was weak, but it was there. His eyelids fluttered. For a brief instant, his eyes opened gray and glassy, struggling to focus. They landed on her face. "Ihu," he tried to say, voice mangled by blood and cold. Alara leaned closer, rain running down her cheek. Her answer was quiet, almost indifferent, but not unkind. Someone who doesn't let men die in the dirt. His gaze held her, as if the image mattered more than the words. Then his eyes rolled back, and his body went limp again. Alara rose slowly. She looked at the road, then the forest. She looked at the fallen men, at the arrow in the chest of the one who'd spoken too much. If she left him here, he would die before dawn. If she took him, she would invite whoever had paid for this to come looking. And they would not stop at one attempt. She stood in the rain, weighing death against danger, and for a moment her face softened with something like resignation. Then she moved. She dragged him heavy-drenched, half-lifeless, toward her horse. She didn't call for help. She didn't shout for the village. She didn't trust anyone to be involved. Alara had learned long ago survival belonged to those who did not depend on strangers. She hauled him up, secured him with rope and strength, and led the horse away from the road before anyone else could arrive. By the time the storm swallowed the scene completely, the Duke who had been meant to die was already disappearing into the countryside with a woman no one had accounted for. But here's the part no one saw coming. The man she pulled out of the mud wasn't just any stranger, and the choice she makes next will bind their lives together in ways neither of them can escape. Tell us what you think so far, and don't forget to subscribe before we move into the most powerful part of the story. Her home was a small cottage tucked among fields and low hills, far enough from the main road that even curious travelers rarely passed. The wood walls held warmth if the fire was kept fed. The roof was old but sound. The place smelled of smoke-dried herbs and the faint, clean bite of iron from tools well used. Alara brought him inside and laid him on a narrow bed. For 3 days time blurred. His fever rose like a tide. He drifted in and out of consciousness sometimes, thrashing, sometimes sinking into stillness so deep Alara had to press fingers to his throat to confirm he hadn't slipped away. She changed bandages with steady hands, cleaning wounds with water heated over flame. She kept the fire alive through the nights, feeding it with the same patient stubbornness she brought to everything else. She didn't speak much. There was no one to speak to. And she didn't believe words could do the work that mattered. But sometimes in the darkest hours when his breathing hitched and his skin burned, he mumbled fragments, broken, haunted sounds. "Don't let them," he whispered, once barely audible. Alara paused, cloth in her hand. She studied his face, too pale, too sharp for a common traveler. She could have asked who. She could have pressed for answers. Instead, she leaned close enough that he might hear through fever. "You're not dying," she told him, voice firm. "Not here." The rain outside finally eased. The storm passed. But the fight inside his body continued. On the fourth morning, light filtered through the small window, thin and pale. Alara was adding wood to the fire when she heard a sound behind her, soft, unfamiliar. A breath drawn in, steady. She turned. His eyes were open. He stared at the wooden ceiling as if it were a sky he'd never seen. He blinked, slow, confused. Alara stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching. He swallowed, throat working. "Where?" he rasped. "Where am I?" "Somewhere safe," Alara said. He turned his head slightly, eyes scanning the room, the simple furniture, the shelves, the hearth. None of it spoke to him. Then he looked at her, and his brow tightened with effort. "Who am I?" Alara didn't answer immediately. She watched him the way she watched a wild animal waiting for the sudden snap of remembered aggression for the moment the mask fell. But his gaze held only confusion. Not performance, not deceit. He truly didn't know. Alara stepped closer, then stopped at a distance that felt safe. He licked dry lips, voice barely more than air. "Do I have a name?" Alara's silence stretched. She could have told him the truth she didn't know. She could have guessed. She could have invented a lie. Instead, she said flat and practical, not one that matters right now. He didn't argue. He didn't demand. He simply accepted it with a faint, exhausted nod, as if the lack of a name made sense in a world that had nearly killed him. Alara added, "You're alive." "That's enough." The words hung between them, heavy but steady. Days passed. His strength returned in cautious increments. He learned how to sit up without dizziness, how to drink broth without shaking too much, how to stand without collapsing. When he could finally remain upright for more than a few minutes, Alara looked at him and sighed, as if conceding to an irritation. "I can't keep calling you Hey," she said. He looked up, waiting. "Ash," she decided. The name landed simple, clean. He repeated it quietly. "Ash," as if testing whether it belonged. Alara's mouth barely moved when she explained, "You survived." "That's enough reason." Ash lay back again, eyes drifting to the ceiling. "I don't remember anything," he admitted, voice faint but honest. Alara nodded once as if that settled it. "Then start from here." And for the first time since waking, Ash closed his eyes without tension in his face. The cottage was still foreign. The woman beside him was a stranger with a sword. But the air wasn't hostile. No voices shouted his title. No hands grabbed his collar. No blades waited in the trees. For the first time, he felt something he couldn't name. Safety. Recovery didn't make him gentle. It made him restless. As soon as he could walk the length of the room without swaying, Ash began to hover near the door as if the walls offended him. He watched Alara's routines with a sharp, quiet attention. One morning she shoved an axe handle toward him and nodded at a pile of uncut wood outside. "If you can stand," she said, "you can work." Ash blinked at the axe like it was an insult, then stepped outside anyway. The first swing was a disaster. The blade hit the log wrong and bounced. The second nearly slipped from his hands, and he caught it at the last second with a jerk of reflex that looked practiced. His jaw tightened. The expression on his face wasn't frustration alone. It was almost disbelief, as if his own clumsiness offended a part of him that remembered competence. Alara watched from the doorway, unmoved, saying nothing. Ash adjusted his stance, breath steadying. He tried again. The axe struck closer to center. The log didn't split, but it trembled. He tried again, and again. Slowly, rhythm-formed arms, moving with more precision, feet shifting until balance felt right. Within minutes, his swings grew cleaner, more controlled. He exhaled, surprised at himself. "Feels like," he murmured, staring at the axe head. "I've done things like this before." Alara didn't smile. She only said, "Then your body remembers what your mind doesn't." It should have comforted him. Instead, it unsettled him. Because if his body remembered, what else did it know? He took on more tasks, partly out of gratitude, partly out of a need to feel useful, and partly because stillness left too much room for questions. He repaired a section of the fence that leaned dangerously. He hauled water from the well, adjusting his grip without thinking, lifting the bucket with a strength that returned faster than it should have. One afternoon, Alara left paper and charcoal on the table while she stepped outside. Ash sat down and stared at the blank surface for a long time, then picked up the charcoal without knowing why. His hand moved. Letters formed clean, evenly spaced, the kind of handwriting that came from years of instruction and expectation. He wrote a line, then another, then froze. Alara returned and saw the page. She stopped. The smallest pause, barely visible, passed over her face. "You said you remember nothing?" She said. Ash stared at the words as if they belonged to someone else. "I don't." He wasn't lying. That was the problem. A few days later, a horse tied near the cottage suddenly jerked its head, pulling the rope hard. The movement was fast, violent. Ash turned and, without thinking, stepped in, caught the rope, and calmed the animal with a firm hand and a low murmur that felt like instinct. Alara watched, eyes narrowing. When Ash looked back at her, he found her studying him as if he were a locked door. He tried to speak, but no explanation came. There was nothing to explain. He only shrugged, and Alara turned away without comment. But the distance between them changed, not larger, not smaller, just altered, as if a new layer had been added. Suspicion. Alara didn't interrogate him. She didn't demand a story. She simply watched. And Ash felt it like a weight he couldn't shake. To distract himself, he began paying attention to the sword on her wall and the way she moved with it. Alara was not the sort of woman who displayed weapons for decoration. The blade was used, the grip worn, the balance perfect. One evening, without looking at him, she handed him a wooden practice sword. "You can't rely on luck twice," she said. Ash took it awkward, at first, fingers unsure. Alara stepped in close enough to adjust his hands. Her touch was brief and precise, placing his grip, shifting his weight, setting his feet. Again she ordered. Ash moved slowly, mimicry at first. His swings were heavy, his guard too wide. Alara corrected him with short, blunt instructions. "Too high. Don't lean. Breathe." Then she attacked him lightly, at first testing. Ash barely blocked. He stumbled back, surprised by how quickly she moved. Alara didn't soften. She struck again. Ash lifted the wooden sword to block then. In the next heartbeat, something inside him clicked. He didn't think. He moved. He turned, stepped, and countered with a clean, perfect motion that knocked Alara's weapon aside and left his practice blade at her throat. Both of them froze. Rain tapped lightly at the window. The fire cracked once in the hearth. Everything else was still. Ash stared at his own hands. "I didn't think," he said, voice low, almost frightened. "I just moved." Alara's eyes were sharper than the blade. "That's not instinct," she said. "That's training." Ash lowered the sword slowly, as if afraid it might betray him again. He should have felt pride. Instead, a cold unease crept through him. If he had training, then he had a life. And if he had a life, why did it feel like it was waiting just out of sight, ready to come back and claim him? Days settled into a rhythm. Morning work, afternoon repairs, quiet meals. Practice with the wooden sword when Alara deemed it necessary. They didn't talk much, but the silence began to feel less like distance and more like shared space. At night, they ate by the fire. The cottage glowed warm inside, while the countryside outside remained dark and wide and uncaring. One evening, Ash stared into the flames and said softly, "This feels quieter than it should be." Alara raised an eyebrow. "You prefer noise." Ash shook his head. "No, I think I came from it." Alara didn't ask what he meant. She only watched him for a moment, then returned to her meal. Another day, while repairing the roof, Ash climbed higher than he should have with his still healing body. He moved with sure footing, as if heights held no threat. From below, Alara called, "You're not afraid of falling." Ash paused, looking down. Rain clouds drifted low over the fields. "I don't think I've ever been allowed to be," he answered. The words surprised even him. They left his mouth like something remembered rather than invented. Alara's gaze held him longer after that. Not softer, just deeper, as if she were tracing the outline of a man she still couldn't see. When the time came to visit the market in the nearby village, Alara brought Ash with her. She didn't announce him. She didn't introduce him. She simply walked beside him, cloak drawn tight, as if daring anyone to ask questions. People stared anyway. A stranger in simple clothes could pass unnoticed. But Ash didn't move like a laborer. His posture was straight, his gaze composed, his steps measured. Even when he carried a basket, he carried it like a man unused to such work. A merchant leaned close to another man and murmured loud enough for Ash to hear, "That man doesn't walk like he belongs here." Ash didn't react. He didn't even turn his head. But Alara saw the slight tightening in his jaw. Martha Bell. Alara's neighbor, a sturdy woman with warm eyes and a sharper tongue, approached with a basket of herbs and suspicion written across her face. She glanced at Ash, then at Alara. Later, when Ash stepped away to examine bread, Martha tugged Alara aside. "That man doesn't belong to this place," she whispered. "But he stays because of you." Alara's expression didn't change. "He stays because he's alive." Martha snorted softly. "Alive is easy. Staying is harder." Alara didn't answer. She watched Ash from across the stall, and something in her eyes shifted not into softness, but into acknowledgement. Attachment crept in through small things. Ash started chopping wood before Alara asked. He repaired what he noticed without being told. He began bringing water in from the well when he saw her hands full. One afternoon, Alara nicked her hand while working. The cut was small, but blood welled bright against her skin. Without thinking, Ash reached for her wrist. His grip was gentle but firm. "Hold still," he said. Alara's eyes flicked up, surprised more by his tone than the injury. She had expected demand or panic. Instead, he moved with careful competence, cleaning the cut, wrapping it with cloth, tightening the knot with practiced precision. "You take care of everything," he said, quietly, as he finished. "Someone should take care of you." Alara didn't pull away. She didn't speak. But for a moment her hand remained in his, and the space between them felt smaller than it had any right to. That night, rain returned, soft, patient, tapping at the roof instead of roaring. Ash and Alara sat by the fire. The cottage was quiet enough that the crackling wood sounded loud. Minutes passed without words. Then Ash spoke, voice barely above the fire. "I don't remember my past." He looked at her as if the confession hurt. "But I don't want a future without you." Alara's gaze lifted to him. The firelight painted her face in warm shadows, highlighting the sharpness of her eyes. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away. And in that stillness, Ash felt something settle inside him, something like certainty, fragile but real. After that, they didn't speak of love. They didn't name it. Alara would have rejected the word if it tried to dress itself in poetry. But their lives began to interlock. Ash stayed near her at night without intending to. Alara allowed him closer without acknowledging the permission. Their shoulders brushed more often. Their silences became shared rather than separate. Love formed the way a fire forms, slow-fed, by small, steady choices, until one day you look up and realize the room is warm. Then the dreams began. At first, Ash dismissed them. Nightmares were normal after violence, he told himself. But these weren't shapeless fears. They were places. He dreamed of a long corridor, stone underfoot, echoing steps. He dreamed of warm golden light from chandeliers. He dreamed of people standing aside as he passed, heads bowed. In one dream, he held a real sword, cold-balanced, familiar. He stood in a grand room with high ceilings and banners, the weight of expectation pressing down. He woke suddenly, breath ragged sweat, cold against his skin. Alara's voice came from the dark beside him, calm but alert. Another dream Ash swallowed, staring at the ceiling. "It felt real," he said. Alara didn't reply, but he could feel her wakefulness, her attention, like a blade unsheathed in the dark. In the days that followed, Ash sometimes stood outside and stared into the distance for long stretches. He wasn't looking at anything specific. He was listening to something inside his own head that he couldn't fully hear. Alara noticed. One afternoon she said, not accusing, but sharp, "You're here, but you're not staying." Ash turned his eyes to her. There was something in them now that hadn't been there before, a shadow of knowing. He didn't answer, because he didn't have an answer that wouldn't break something. He sensed it, the past circling. The life he'd forgotten, waiting like a storm beyond the hills. Alara didn't press. She understood pressing could send him running. She also understood waiting could mean losing him anyway. So she watched, and Ash tried to hold on to the present harder, as if grip alone could keep it from slipping away. One late afternoon, sunlight broke through clouds in thin beams, turning the wet fields briefly gold. No urgent work waited. No chores demanded. For once, the world paused. Ash stood beside Alara in the yard. Their shoulders were close, not touching. They both faced the horizon. Neither spoke for a long time. Then Ash said softly, as if admitting a crime, "If I had a past, I think I'd trade it for this." Alara turned her head slightly, studying him. She didn't answer, but she didn't deny it. The air between them was peaceful, too peaceful, as if the countryside itself held its breath. because even in that calm, there was a feeling underneath it, quiet and unmistakable. This moment was real. And real things, Ash was beginning to understand, did not last without cost. The afternoon the past returned was quieter than it had any right to be. The sky hung low and gray over the fields, not storming, not clearing, just pressing down with that dull weight that made even familiar places feel slightly wrong. A light wind moved through the bare branches near the cottage, rattling them like bones. Inside, the fire had burned down 2 embers. The house smelled of ash and dried herbs and the clean sting of iron from tools that were used, not displayed. Alara had gone out early to check the far fence line, the one that always threatened to sag after rain. She didn't ask Ash to come. She never asked. She simply expected that if he could help, he would, and if he couldn't, he wouldn't pretend. Ash had stayed behind, sleeves rolled, repairing a loose plank in the corner of the cottage, an old section of wall Alara rarely touched. It was the one part of the house that still felt like it belonged to someone else, some earlier life she never spoke about. He pulled at the plank and found it gave more easily than he expected. The wood creaked, then slid aside, revealing a small gap. Dust rolled out in a faint cloud. Ash hesitated. He didn't know why he hesitated. Curiosity was natural, but this felt different, like standing at the edge of something he could not step away from once he looked down. He reached into the gap, and his fingers found the edge of a wooden chest. The chest was old, unvarnished, the grain of the wood darkened with years. It wasn't locked, but it was coated in a thin layer of dust that suggested it had not been opened in a long time. Ash dragged it out into the light, setting it on the floorboards with care. He lifted the lid. Inside lay 2 things. A metal seal, heavy cold, its surface carved with a crest so sharp the lines still looked newly cut. And beside it, folded neatly, a scrap of embroidered cloth, a noble insignia stitched in thread that had faded slightly but remained unmistakable in its design. Ash stared. He didn't recognize the objects in the way one recognizes a familiar tool or a remembered place. He recognized them the way the body recognizes fire, before thought, before logic, before permission. He picked up the seal. The moment his fingers touched the raised emblem, something slammed into him. His heartbeat stuttered. Not fear, not surprise, recognition. A wave of images cracked open in his mind like ice splitting under sudden force. Stone corridors, cold underfoot, high ceilings, the faint perfume of polished wood and candle smoke. People lining walls, heads bowed as he passed, the sound of his own footsteps echoing with authority, and a voice, more than one voice, calling out, clear and familiar, "Your Grace." Ash's breath caught. His grip tightened without realizing it. Then his hand loosened, and the seal slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a heavy clank that sounded too loud in the small cottage. He staggered back 1 step, then another. Air rushed in and out of his lungs too fast, as if his body was trying to outrun something it couldn't escape. He pressed his palm against the wall, steadying himself. The memories did not trickle in. They returned all at once, brutal in their completeness. He stood there for a long time, unmoving, eyes fixed on nothing. The cottage around him blurred, as if it were the dream and the other-world stone, and titles and blood was the reality. His gaze sharpened, changed. The lost, searching softness of Ash vanished, replaced by something older, heavier. He whispered a name into the empty room, voice raw. Alistair Whitmore. His own name. It fit like a key turning in a lock. He remembered his family, the Whitmore estate, the obligations that had shaped his life since childhood, long before he had learned what he wanted. He remembered the weight of being watched, judged, used. He remembered meetings where men spoke of land and alliances like they were whether inevitable and impersonal. He remembered the night on the road. It hadn't been robbery. He understood that now with chilling clarity. It had been an assassination attempt, organized, patient, designed to end him and erase him. Faces flashed through his mind, men in shadows, but also faces in candle-lit rooms. A smile that wasn't kind, a voice that had always sounded too polite. A name hovered just out of reach like a word on the tongue that refuses to form. He could feel the shape of it. He could sense the intention behind it. But before he could grasp it fully, another reality pulled at him. The cottage, the fire, the smell of bread, Elara's calm voice, the simple life he had been building piece by piece with hands that had forgotten how to be anything but useful. Two worlds stood side by side in his head, one of power and duty, one of quiet and warmth. And for a moment, Alistair Whitmore stood between them, suddenly terrified that simply choosing would destroy something irreplaceable. Footsteps sounded outside, light steady. Alara entered without announcement, as she always did, cloak damp from wind hair tied low. She stopped when she saw the chest open on the floor. She didn't rush. She didn't speak immediately. Her eyes moved from the seal to the embroidered cloth and then to Ash's face. A brief, sharp pause, not fear, not shock, recognition of change. "You found something," she asked, voice even. Alistair Ash looked at her. The urge to tell her surged up like a confession he couldn't hold back. "I remember. I'm not who you think. But the words died against a different instinct. The instinct that had kept him alive in halls full of wolves. The instinct to protect what mattered by controlling what was known." His eyes flickered with conflict. His jaw tightened. There was one heartbeat where he almost spoke truth. Then he lied. "Nothing. I understand," he said quietly. The first lie tasted bitter. Elara didn't react outwardly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't question further. But she didn't look away either. Her gaze stayed on him, sharp as a blade, as if she were measuring the weight of his answer and finding it wrong. Ash turned his face slightly, as if the angle might hide what his eyes could not. The decision formed in the silence between them. He would not tell her. Not yet. Not because he thought she couldn't handle it, because he was afraid of what truth would cost him. Elara said nothing. She stepped around the chest, removed her cloak, and hung it by the hearth. Her movements were calm, almost ordinary, except for the way her attention never fully left him. Ash bent down, closed the chest, and pushed it back into the corner with hands that didn't quite stop shaking. Later, when Elara went outside again, he followed with his eyes until the door closed behind her. Then he stepped into the yard and stared at the small cottage as if it might vanish if he blinked. He looked at the humble fence line, the worn chopping block, the path he and Elara had worn into the mud with ordinary footsteps. And he spoke barely above a whisper, as if the wind might carry it away before it became real. "If she knows, everything changes." His throat tightened. He remembered his world, how it judged, how it used, how it crushed anything that didn't fit into its polished patterns. He remembered how someone like Elara would be treated if she stepped into it. Not with gratitude, with suspicion, with condescension, with cruelty disguised as etiquette. He clenched his hands hard enough that his knuckles whitened. "And I'll lose this, before I even had it." The truth was shameful in its simplicity. He didn't want to go back. He didn't want the title that had always been more cage than crown. He wanted the warmth of the cottage, the rhythm of chopping wood, the quiet evenings, Alara's presence like a steady heartbeat in a life he hadn't known he needed. And if truth threatened, that he would hold truth back, even if it meant becoming someone Alara would not forgive. From that day on, she noticed the changes immediately. Ash became more careful. He spoke less, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had too much to hide. His gaze deepened, sharpened, as if he were calculating possibilities. He began to pause before answering questions, weighing words like a man used to consequences. At dinner one night, Alara watched him in silence as he ate. Finally, she said, "You're quieter than usual." Ash forced a small, almost believable shrug. "Maybe I'm starting to remember how to think." He replied. It sounded reasonable. It even sounded true. But it wasn't the truth. Alara didn't challenge him. She simply nodded, as if storing the sentence away for later. Another evening, Ash stood near the wall where Alara kept her sword. He stared at it longer than necessary, eyes fixed on the worn grip and the clean line of the blade. Alara noticed, of course. She always noticed. "You recognize it?" she asked. Ash didn't turn his head right away. When he did, his expression was controlled, careful. "No," he said. Then, after the slightest hesitation, he added, "But I recognize what it means." It was half true. He did recognize what it meant. Survival, choice, power taken back from men who assumed it belonged to them. Alara's face gave nothing away, but something in her eyes cooled. She was beginning to feel it now, not the return of his memory, but the existence of something he was not sharing. The cottage grew smaller in the space between them, not because the walls moved, but because honesty had stopped breathing. One night, the fire burned low. Wind tapped the window. Ash sat beside Alara, with his hands clasped as if holding himself together. He looked at her and asked softly, "If I remembered everything, would you want to know?" Alara didn't hesitate. Yes, one word, clear, absolute. Ash opened his mouth. The confession rose in his throat like a flood. "I'm Alistair. I'm a duke. I remember you saving me. I remember the road. I remember then." He saw her face steady and unyielding. He saw what truth would demand decisions, consequences change. His courage broke under the weight of what he feared losing. He closed his mouth again and lowered his gaze. "I don't think I'm ready," he admitted. Alara stared at him for a long time. She didn't press. She didn't scold. But the trust in her eyes shifted, small, subtle, irreversible. A distance began there, quiet and sharp. In the days that followed, Ash started spending more time outside, standing at the edge of the yard and staring into the fields, as if listening to something only he could hear. Alara watched him from the doorway. One afternoon she said, her voice not angry, just precise. "You're here, but you're not staying." Ash didn't answer, because he knew she was right. He was still physically present, still chopping wood, still mending fences, still sharing meals. But part of him had already stepped back into the world that had claimed him by name. The worst part was that he didn't know how to stop it. The morning it all broke open arrived with deceptive peace. Sunlight filtered through thin clouds. The air was cold but not harsh. The ground was damp from last night's mist, but the sky wasn't threatening rain. Ash stood at the chopping block, splitting logs with a practiced rhythm. Alara carried water from the well, her steps steady, her posture relaxed in the rare quiet. Then the sound came. Hooves, not one horse. Many. Ash froze mid-swing, the axe suspended above the log. His body recognized the sound before his mind fully processed it. A tightening in his chest, a familiar urgency, the sense of being found. His eyes lifted toward the road. Ilara turned too, brow furrowing slightly. The riders emerged from behind the hill, a small line of men in uniform cloaks, dark horses strong. Their armor wasn't heavy battle gear, but it was unmistakably official. Their insignia caught the pale light. At the front rode a man older than the rest, posture rigid gaze, searching like a blade sweeping a room. Sir Cedric Halbrook. The moment Cedric saw Ash, his expression shattered. He dismounted before the horse fully stopped. Mud splashed his boots as he crossed the yard quickly, then dropped to one knee in the damp grass, as if his body could not remain upright before the man he served. "Your Grace," Cedric said, voice tight with relief and disbelief. "We've been searching for you." The world stopped. Ilara stood still, water bucket forgotten at her side. For a heartbeat she didn't understand. Her eyes moved from Cedric's bowed head to Ash's face. Ash didn't speak. The silence was confirmation. Ilara's voice came out slow, careful, as if each word might cut her. "Your..." Grace Ash closed his eyes for 1 second, one small, helpless moment. Then he opened them again. There was no point pretending now. The lie had run out of room. Ilara stepped forward 1 pace. Not toward Cedric, toward Ash. Her expression wasn't fury. It wasn't panic. It was cold clarity, the kind that arrives when the mind accepts something the heart refused to believe. "Since when?" she asked. Ash stared at her, and he couldn't find a path that didn't end in pain. He could lie again. He could say today. He could say just now. He could try to soften the blow. But Ilara wasn't someone you could soften the truth for. So he gave her the only honest answer left. "Long enough." The words fell like a stone. Ilara inhaled, but her breath didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply took 1 step back, as if the distance between them was suddenly the only thing keeping her upright. In that step, Ash felt everything he'd been afraid of come true. Ilara looked at him as though she were seeing the entire past weeks again, and watching them change shape. Then she spoke, voice low, controlled, devastating. Then none of this was real. Ash's instincts urged him forward. His body moved a fraction closer before he could stop it. "It was the only real thing I've ever had," he said. Ilara shook her head once. "You chose not to trust me." Ash swallowed hard. "I chose not to lose you." Ilara's eyes hardened, and the next sentence came like a final judgment. "You don't get to decide that for me." Ash stood there, rainless sky above him, and felt as though he were back on that muddy road, surrounded, outnumbered, unable to defend what mattered. Cedric remained kneeling, uncomfortable now, as if he had stepped into a scene he didn't understand. Ilara, Ash began, but she didn't let him finish. She didn't shout. She didn't dramatize her pain. She turned her back on him and walked into the cottage with the calm of someone who knew that if she stayed 1 more second, she might do something she would regret. The door closed, not slammed, just shut. Final. Ash stood outside staring at the wood as if it were a wall built by his own choices. He didn't chase her. He didn't bang on the door, because he understood the worst truth of all. He had already taken enough from her. Cedric rose slowly, face tense. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "we must return. It isn't safe." Ash's voice came out flat. "It was never safe." Cedric hesitated. "We thought you were dead." Ash's eyes stayed on the closed door. "Part of me was," he replied. He mounted the horse when Cedric offered the reins. His movements were controlled, but inside him something cracked with each passing second. He didn't look back at the cottage as they rode away, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. If he looked, he might dismount. If he dismounted, he might refuse to leave. If he refused, he might drag danger back to her doorstep. And he had already done enough damage without adding blood to it. The cottage shrank behind them, swallowed by fields and mist, until it became only a shape in memory, warm, small, and now unreachable. For the first time since he'd woken in Ilara's bed, Alistair Whitmore returned as a duke. And for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to have everything and to feel like he had nothing. Whitmore Manor rose from the landscape like a statement carved in stone. The gates were tall, the ironwork pristine, the servants waiting in lines as if the world itself required order. The house was flawless, polished wood, clean marble candles burning in steady, controlled light. And yet it felt colder than the rain-soaked cottage ever had. Alistair stepped through the grand doors and the hall swallowed him. People bowed, voices murmured. Someone called him "Your Grace" again, and the words landed like chains. Lady Rowena stood in the entrance hall as if she had been waiting for this moment every hour of every day he'd been gone. Her posture was perfect, her expression sharp, her eyes taking in every detail of him, with the cold assessment of someone who believed emotions were luxuries. "You disappear for weeks," she said, "and return like nothing happened." Alistair met her gaze, voice calm, but edged with something she hadn't heard from him before. "Something did happen." Rowena's eyes narrowed. "Then remember who you are." It wasn't concern. It was command, a reminder that his identity belonged to the estate, not to him. He walked past her without argument because he knew arguing here would be like punching stone. The manner didn't change. It simply endured until you broke. The days that followed were full of meetings, finance, land disputes, tenant complaints brought in neatly written stacks, letters from neighboring houses, political considerations whispered behind closed doors. Every hour accounted for every decision, weighed as if the world balanced on his pen. And then, as if it were just another ledger entry, the marriage was mentioned. Lady Rowena placed the papers before him with a crisp certainty. "Your marriage has already been discussed," she said. "It stabilizes everything." Alistair stared at the contract. The ink was fresh. The names were chosen. The union designed like a treaty. He didn't react immediately. He felt strangely detached, as though watching someone else's life being assigned to him. Then he asked quietly, "Does it stabilize me?" No one answered, because the question did not belong in this room. In the silence, Alistair understood something with stark clarity. This manor had never been a home. It had been a machine, and he had been raised as one of its parts. That night, alone in his study, he stared at the fire that burned too cleanly, too perfectly. He heard Ilara's voice in his head, not sweet, not pleading, but steady. "Then start from here." He almost laughed at the irony. He had started from there. He had started from nothing, and he had loved it. Now he was surrounded by everything, and it felt like emptiness arranged in expensive shapes. Alistair called Cedric in the next morning and shut the study door behind him. "It wasn't robbery," he said. Cedric's jaw tightened. "We suspected the same." Alistair's gaze sharpened. "I need names." Cedric hesitated only briefly before stepping forward. "We found traces. Men were paid through intermediaries. Not enough to prove in court yet, but there's a pattern." Alistair leaned forward. "Follow it." Days turned into a quiet hunt. Alistair read documents late into the night, comparing signatures, tracing payments, following rumors that had always been dismissed as family politics. And slowly, inevitably, The path led to one man, Marcus. His cousin, always charming, always helpful, always slightly too present when Alistair was absent. Alistair confronted him in a corridor first, where portraits of dead Whitmores stared down like judges. Marcus smiled lightly, as if this were a misunderstanding that amused him. "You disappeared on your own," Cousin Marcus said. "I simply adapted." Alistair stepped closer, voice low enough that servants passing wouldn't hear. "You sent men to kill me." Marcus's smile didn't vanish. It only thinned. "You were never meant for this position," he said softly. "You have always been sentimental." Alistair stared at him, and in that moment the last uncertainty died. He didn't strike Marcus. He didn't explode. He did something colder, something more dangerous. He used the system Marcus thought he controlled. Alistair gathered evidence. He brought in accounts and ledgers. He forced conversations to occur in rooms with witnesses. He allowed Marcus to speak, to boast, to reveal arrogance in his own careful phrasing. And then, in a formal meeting where the family's key supporters gathered, Alistair placed the documents on the table. The room went silent as names and numbers formed a story no one could deny. Marcus's face tightened for the first time. His eyes flashed anger. When guards stepped forward, Marcus laughed once bitter. "You'll regret choosing weakness," he said, as they took his arms. Alistair's voice was quiet, sharp as a blade. "No, I regret mistaking this place for strength." Marcus was removed, order restored. The estate exhaled, as if nothing had happened. Alistair stood in the great hall later alone, listening to the echo of his own footsteps on stone. He had reclaimed power. He had secured the Whitmore name. He had crushed the threat, and none of it made him feel alive. He looked down at his hands that had once split wood-mended fences, held Ilara's injured wrist with careful gentleness. He remembered the glow of firelight in the cottage, the sound of rain on a modest roof, the calm of sharing silence with someone who didn't care what his title was. "This was never what I wanted," he whispered. Lady Rowena found him standing there later as if she could sense weakness like scent. "You finally have control," she said. "Don't waste it." Alistair looked at her, and for the first time he felt no fear of her disapproval. "I already did," he replied. Then he left. No ceremony, no entourage, no farewell to the manor that had never been warm. Cedric tried to protest. "Your Grace," Alistair shook his head. "Not today." He rode out alone, taking the road that led back to the fields and the small cottage that had once given him a life he never expected to want. When he arrived, the house looked the same. The fence line, the yard, the door. But the air around it felt altered, as if the place itself remembered betrayal. He stood before the door and didn't knock immediately. He stared at the wood grain, at the simple handle at the threshold that had once meant safety. He knew what had changed. He had changed it. Finally he knocked. Footsteps. Slow. Controlled. The door opened. Ilara stood there as if she'd been expecting him for years rather than weeks. Her face was calm, but her eyes were guarded. No surprise, no welcome. Just a look that measured truth. Alistair spoke first, because there was no point pretending. "I lied to you." He didn't soften it. He didn't dress it in excuses. "I remembered, and I stayed." Ilara said nothing. Alistair continued, voice steady, even as something inside him shook. "Not because I didn't trust you, but because I was afraid you'd see me differently." Ilara's reply was immediate, quiet cutting. "You didn't trust me with the truth." A pause. Alistair swallowed, forcing the next words out. "I chose to stay because I chose you." Alara stared at him for a long moment. Her face didn't soften. Her posture didn't relax. Then she said, "You don't get forgiveness just because you came back." Alistair nodded once. "I know." Silence stretched between them, thick with everything unsaid. Alara didn't step aside to invite him in, but she didn't close the door. That, in her language, was permission to speak again, to try, to rebuild. Alistair didn't rush forward. He didn't reach for her. He didn't demand. He simply stood there, breathing, letting the moment exist, without forcing it into a shape he wanted. Days after that were small. He returned each morning. Sometimes he helped with chores without speaking. Sometimes he brought supplies from the village. Sometimes he sat at the edge of the yard, letting time do what words couldn't. Alara spoke little, but she watched him, assessing whether the man before her was the same man who had stolen her choice. Slowly, cautiously, conversation returned. Not declarations, not romance, just truth offered in pieces and received without guarantee. When Alara finally agreed to return with him to Whitmore Manor, it wasn't because she'd been conquered by affection. It was because she had decided she would not be pushed out of his world simply because it was larger. She entered the manor without bowing her head. Servants stared. Nobles whispered. But none dared treat her as small, not with Alistair at her side, and not with the quiet authority she carried like a sword at her hip. When Alistair introduced her, he didn't call her a rescuer, a guest, a curiosity. He called her what she was, my wife. The wedding was not a spectacle. It was not designed to impress the world. It was designed to mean something. In the chapel's soft light, Alistair spoke his vow, with a voice that held no arrogance, only certainty. "I stand here not as a duke, but as the man who chose you." Alara's response was brief, as it always was when she meant something most. "Then don't choose differently." Afterward, life unfolded in a way neither of them had been given permission to imagine. Alistair ruled, but he did not let duty devour him. Alara lived in the manor, but she did not become a decoration for its halls. She trained when she wished, walked the grounds like they belonged to her, spoke with a directness that unsettled those who preferred polite cruelty. And slowly, the manor changed. Not in stone, in warmth. Years later, the halls that had once echoed with emptiness filled with laughter. 5 children ran down the corridor, their footsteps wild and bright against the old floors. One carried a wooden sword, swinging it with more confidence than skill. Another sat at a small table near the window tongue between their teeth as they practiced careful letters on paper, copying their father's precise script. One child tripped and fell, then popped back up, instantly brushing off knees, as if pain were nothing but a pause. Alistair stood at the far end of the hall, watching his face softened into something peace had carved there over time. Alara stood beside him, hand resting almost unconsciously on the hilt of the sword she still kept close. Not because she feared the world, but because the blade had become part of who she was. Alistair exhaled, gaze following the children. "I was meant to die that night," he said quietly. Alara didn't look at him when she answered. She looked at the chaos of their family, at the life built from choices and consequences. "No," she said, "you were meant to live, just not the life you thought." Alistair's eyes lingered on the wooden sword, on the careful handwriting, on the children's unthinking confidence, half his steadiness, half her fire. The manor no longer felt cold. The sword was still there. And the family, loud, imperfect, real, was what kept everything in place. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. Sometimes the life we never planned becomes the one we were meant to live. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy stories about unexpected love and second chances. And if you're not ready to leave yet, there are many more unforgettable stories waiting for you right here.